Welcome to the DK Custom Products channel. We appreciate you watching the video. My name is Kevin. This is Dwayne. And today we're going to talk about what we measure as far as temperature on the bike.
The two most relevant temp measurements you can take on your Harley Davidson, obviously the oil temperature, but don't get that confused with the engine temp or the engine temp readout that comes from your temp sensor. So yeah, those two things are, one and the same as far as affecting one another. They can have an effect on each other, but we like to approach them as mutually exclusive. Take measures to lower your oil temperature. And there's a whole nother path at lowering the engine temperature. But once you do both of those things, it comes together to a big end result overall.
The oil does not generate any heat.
Right.
All the heat in the oil is coming from the engine temperature. So we primarily address engine temperature, primarily because if we lower the engine temperature, it's going to lower the oil temperature. But we look at the oil temperature because it does give us some indication of what's happening with the engine temperature.
That's right.
But what happens, because we have a lot of videos on temperature and because a lot of people complain about how hot their bikes are, people get confused about what are we measuring.
Right.
Here are the two things that we measure. We measure the oil temperature and we measure that at the tank. So on a sporty and on a Softail, that's at the tank, that's under the seat.
It's a physical measurement with a prod.
Right. And so, you can get oil temp dipsticks and just use those. You can get them digital. You can get them analog.
You can borrow the wife's cooking thermometer.
Or you can just use a turkey, whatever those things you put into a turkey to measure the temperature. You can literally put that in. Do not use infrared. Infrared is not going to give you a good temperature reading of your oil or your engine. We have a whole video on that we'll put up in the corner. So we look at the engine temperature and we look at the oil temperature. Oil temp measured at the dipstick. And we have a whole video on what is the optimum oil temperature. We'll put that up in the corner, but we'll also put on the screen right here, Harley says normal oil temperature is 230 degrees. It boggles my mind a little bit that people will see that Harley says that the normal operating temperature is 230, and then they'll go, oh, AMSOIL or Redline or this oil or that oil can withstand 400 degrees. Without getting into a debate of whether the oil can really withstand that much temperature, it's sort of irrelevant. The temperature of the oil should not be over 230 degrees. That is the temperature that the Harley is designed to run at, is 230, not 260, not 280, not 320, or I have AMSOIL, it will handle 460. Who cares what the oil will handle? Your oil temperature should not be above 230, and fortunately, it's fairly easy to make sure that your bike is not going to be over 230 degrees at the tank.
And I think one of the reasons it's so confusing to everyone is because the two temp measurements we're talking about today, your bike won't even show you. The bike obviously doesn't show you oil temperature, but it doesn't show you engine temp either. It's almost as if Harley wants to keep it a secret so that they don't get 100 phone calls a day like, hey, why is my bike 400 degrees? That's not cool. And then they have to explain this or that. So that's what's crazy about it. So the way you measure oil temperature, like Kevin said, physically with a thermometer, we like to use the temp gauge dipsticks, but you actually have to have a device plugged into your data port to see engine temp.
Right, and we use the FP4 will do it, but we use the Power Vision.
But yeah, you have to have an aftermarket device plugged into your data port to even get that readout.
Right, and so the thing that gets confusing, besides people confusing oil temperature with engine temperature, whenever we talk about it, we try and be, if we're talking about the temperature of something and it's oil temperature we're talking about, we try and say oil temperature. But a lot of times people just hear temperature. So that's one confusion between oil temperature and engine temperature. The other confusion is on these devices, say for instance the Power Vision, there is a choice of like 30 or 50 different gauges that you can display.
Right.
One of them is labeled ET for engine temperature.
Right.
And then there's another one that's labeled head T for, you would think, cylinder head temperature. And the sensor that Harley puts in the bikes at the factory is embedded in the cylinder head. So you would think that that head temperature is a readout of that temperature. It's not.
Right.
The one that says ET is the direct readout from the sensor. We have a whole video we'll put up in the corner here about what the Optimum ET, which is the measurement of the head temperature, is for. A Sporty is one, the twin cams are different, and then the M8s are yet another temperature of what's the ideal temperature for the ET, not the head T.
Right.
That's a completely different temperature measurement that we're not going to talk about in this video. We're going to have another video that we're going to talk about that in.
Right, and they all have different ideal temp readouts because the temp sensor is in different locations. For example, the twin cam temp sensor is on the rear of the front cylinder. The M8 is on the front of the rear cylinder. So they're in different locations.
Right, and the front cylinder gets way more wind. It's going to run cooler. So when they went to the M8, they put it on the front of the rear cylinder, which runs hotter than the front cylinder. So your temperature, the overall temperature of the engine on the twin cam can be exactly the same as the M8, but the M8 is going to read a higher temperature because the sensor is in the rear cylinder. And then, of course, the Sportster, it's in the top of the rear cylinder. It will read far hotter than the twin cam or the M8, when in actuality, the overall engine's about the same temperature. So just to be aware of that, and that video that we put up in the corner talks about what the optimum temperatures are in each. The main purpose of this video is to be very clear. When we're talking about temperatures, we're always talking about either oil temperature or engine temperature of the sensor that is embedded by Harley in either the front or the rear cylinder head. Now, most of the time, there's not trouble on many bikes. There's not trouble with the oil temperature ever getting too hot. Some bikes, the oil temperature does get too hot, and there's easy fixes for that.
Right, and it's usually the water-cooled models that don't have an oil cooler.
Don't have an oil cooler, right. And then some people might have a really hot bike that just runs hotter.
Yeah.
And there were times in the past that I actually ran 2 oil coolers at the advice of an engine builder. I just called them and I said, look, you build engines. I'm trying to get my oil temperature to be where it's supposed to be, 230 or lower, and I'm not having any success with it. What do you do? And he said, it's simple. I run a second oil cooler. So, you don't want that temperature in the oil going over 230, and that's fairly easy to achieve. Harley, we have a whole video that we'll put up in the corner here. Harley did a fantastic job on the M8 Softails, where they put the biggest oil cooler they've ever put on any bike is on the M8 Softail. And that oil temperature on those bikes, untouched, pretty much stays where it needs to be.
Yeah, my oil temp is beautiful. It rarely gets above 220.
So, but then you have, then that's that.
Okay.
Now, and again, the engine temperature that we use is from the sensor that's embedded in the heads. That's where almost all twin cams and M8s have a problem. We have a whole series of videos on how to cool down your twin cam in Milwaukee 8. We'll put that in the upper corner there. Now,
we're aware there's 2 trains of thought on Harley temperature. There's some people that just bury their head in the sand and don't care about it, because I hear this a lot. I've been riding bikes since the 80s. I've had 40 different Harleys. But if you really read between the lines, that particular guy didn't have a single bike long enough for engine temp to be an issue. And that's the case with a lot of people. And we're aware of that. We know a lot of people out there, myself included, will probably go through bikes like they go through boots. You know, every couple of years they get a different bike. And then that bike is someone else's problem and you got a new bike. So we like to collect data so that we can see before and after, because we put a lot of stock in keeping these bikes cool. So you can get a baseline readout. You're like, hey, it's a little hot. You add an oil cooler. Hey, it came down here. You add a fan or something. You add, put your oil filter out into the wind, a little cooler. So it's nice to collect that data and see progress. So that's a big reason why we do a lot of collection of this data, and that's how we get it. Temp readout on the aftermarket Power Vision and physically measuring oil temperature. But if you have any questions at all about anything you've seen in this video, leave us a comment or shoot me an email to support@dkcustomproducts.com.
You all right, Sam?